22, I put my name on my parents' mortgage as a favor. At 51, I found out I owed £240,000 I never borrowed. The phone call that ended my ordinary life came from a call center on a Wednesday afternoon from a man who was reading a script and had no idea what he was doing to me. He said he was calling about the mortgage account and that it was in arrears, and that as a named borrower I was jointly and severally liable, and that if the arrears weren't cleared, recovery action would follow, and that this may affect any property you own. And I said, I think you've got the wrong person. I don't have a mortgage. And he said, you're a joint borrower on the account, madam, have been since 2001. 2001, I was 22 in 2001. And I had that year signed something for my parents, a form, a favor, a nothing, that I had not thought about in 22 years. And the man on the phone told me that the balance of that account was £240,000. And that it was in arrears, and that I owed it, not a share of it, all of it. Every penny, jointly and severally, which I would learn means that the lender can pursue any one borrower for the entire debt. And I was the borrower with a house and a job and a credit rating worth pursuing. £240,000 on a house I did not own, borrowed by people who were not me, spent on things I never saw, and it was, in law, entirely mine to pay. Let me back up. My name is Adiz Nwasu. I'm 53 now, and I want to tell you about the most expensive favor anyone has ever done for their family, and about the thing I did not understand at 22 that cost me my 50s, and it is this. There's a world of difference between owning something and being liable for it, and the cruelest position of all is to be liable without owning. And that is exactly the position a joint borrower who is not an owner is in. And almost nobody who signs up for it understands what they've done. I was not a guarantor. A guarantor has limited, defined exposure. I was not a co-owner with a share to protect. I was a joint borrower, fully, personally, individually liable for the entire mortgage debt, on a house I had no ownership of, no benefit from, and for over 2 decades, no knowledge of what was happening to. My parents put my name on their mortgage when I was 22, telling me it was a formality, that I would never pay anything, that it was only so the numbers worked for the lender. And then, over 22 years, behind that name, they borrowed and borrowed and borrowed against the house, taking out equity I never saw, until the debt was 5 times the original, and the house was worth barely more than what was owed on it. And every pound of it, in law, was as much mine as theirs. It took me 2 years, a stack of remortgage documents. I had to force out of a lender a broker's file that revealed I'd never been advised at all. And the discovery of where £110,000 of my borrowing had actually gone to get out from under a favor I'd done at 22. Let me tell you about my family, and about the day I signed, because the day I signed is the whole thing, and it took about 20 minutes. My parents came here from Nigeria in the 1970s. My father was a mechanic, my mother worked in a care home, and they bought their house in Birmingham in 1989. They were proud, hardworking, and I say this with love and with the clarity that 2 years of this has given me, financially chaotic in a way I did not understand until I was 51. There were 3 of us. My older brother, Chike, who was always the favorite and always in some scheme or other. Me, the middle one, the sensible one, the one who did well at school and became an accounts clerk, and then, over the years, an accountant. My younger sister, Ngozi, who moved to Canada at 24 and is, in this story, mercifully absent and entirely blameless. In 2001, when I was 22, my parents came to me with a problem. They wanted to remortgage the house. I didn't fully understand why at the time, and now I understand all too well. And the lender, they said, wouldn't lend them enough on their own incomes. My father was self-employed, which made his income hard to prove, and my mother's care home wage was small. But if a third person with a steady salary job went on the mortgage, the numbers would work, and I had a steady salary job. I was 22, an accounts clerk, on a modest but reliable wage, and I had, in the eyes of a lender, exactly the kind of provable income my parents lacked. So my father asked me to go on the mortgage. And here is exactly how he put it, and I have repeated it to 3 solicitors. It's just your name on the form, Ada, so the numbers work. You won't pay anything, we pay the mortgage, we've always paid the mortgage. It's just so the bank is happy. You're helping your mom and dad keep their home. It's just your name on the form. I want to be honest about why I signed, because why did you sign is the question everyone asks, and the answer is the reason this happens to thousands of people. I signed because I was 22, and my father asked me to help him keep the family home. What 22-year-old says no to that? I signed because I trusted my parents completely, and it did not occur to me, genuinely did not cross my mind, that they would ever do anything that put me at risk. I signed because I did not understand, at 22, the difference between a guarantor and a joint borrower, and nobody explained it to me, because the entire process was arranged by my parents' broker, whose client was my parents, and who had no duty to me at all. I did not get independent legal advice. Nobody suggested I should. I did not read the mortgage offer. I was handed a document at a solicitor's office shown where to sign, and I signed in about the time it takes to sign a birthday card. Because my dad was standing next to me, and the solicitor was my parents' solicitor, and everyone was treating it as the formality my father had described. And here is the specific thing I did not understand, the thing that is the entire tragedy, and that I would put on a billboard if I could. I was made a joint borrower, but I was never made a joint owner. My name went on the mortgage, the debt. My name did not go on the deeds, the ownership. So I took on full personal liability for the loan, and I received, in exchange, no share of the house, no equity, no asset, nothing. I got all of the risk and none of the ownership. I was, from that day, a person who could be pursued for the entire mortgage debt on a house that was legally, entirely, my parents'. At 22, I did not know that was even a thing that could happen. I thought being on the mortgage and owning the house were the same act. They are not, and the gap between them is where I live for the next 22 years without knowing it. I want to reconstruct the actual 20 minutes of signing, because I have gone over it 1,000 times, and because the details of how it was done are the details of how it is done to everyone. I went to a solicitor's office, my parents' solicitor, a man my father had used for years, who greeted my parents warmly and treated me as an appendage to them, which is exactly what I was in that transaction. My father sat beside me. My mother sat on the other side. There was a document, many pages, and the solicitor turned to the pages that needed signing and indicated where. Nobody read the document to me. Nobody asked me to read it. Nobody asked whether I understood what a joint borrower was, or whether I understood I would not be an owner, or whether I understood I was accepting personal liability for the whole loan. Nobody asked whether I was signing freely or under pressure from the two parents sitting on either side of me. Nobody suggested I might want my own solicitor, separate from my parents, to explain what I was taking on. The solicitor said something like, "And if you could just sign here and initial these." And my father said, "Good girl," and I signed. And it took, from walking in to walking out, perhaps 20 minutes, and most of that was my parents chatting with the solicitor about people they knew. That is the entire origin of £250,000 of personal liability. 20 minutes, no advice, no reading, no questions, a solicitor acting for my parents, and a 22-year-old signing where she was told because her father called her a good girl. And here's the thing that took me years to be angry about, rather than ashamed. Shame came first. How could I have been so stupid? I should have read it, I should have asked. But I was not stupid. I was 22, and I was in a room engineered to produce exactly one outcome, which was my signature. And every adult professional in that room had a duty that ran to my parents, and not to me, and the one safeguard that exists for precisely this situation. Independent advice for the person taking on the liability was simply skipped. Because skipping it was easier and cheaper, and nobody in that room had any incentive to insist on it. I did not fail to protect myself. I was placed in a situation constructed so that I could not protect myself, and then told for 22 years that it was a favor. Let me tell you about those 22 years, because the horror of it is how completely nothing happened. For 22 years, I gave it no thought at all. My parents paid the mortgage, as they'd said they would. I never received a statement. The account was managed by them. The correspondence went to their address, and I was, functionally, a name on a document in a drawer. I moved out, built my career, got my own flat, then my own house with my own separate mortgage, married, divorced, lived an entire adult life. And the whole time, my name sat on my parents' mortgage account, and I never thought about it, because I had been told it was nothing and it behaved, for 22 years, like nothing. I did not know that in 2004, they remortgaged and released £20,000. I did not know that in 2007, at the top of the market, they remortgaged again and released $40,000. I did not know that in 2011 and 2015 and 2019, they went back to the well again, and again, each time borrowing more against a house that was, on paper, jointly mortgaged by me, each time with my name on an account. I never saw each remortgage requiring technically my consent, which was somehow always obtained, and I will come back to how. The original mortgage in 2001 was for about £70,000. By 2023, the debt against that house was $240,000. The house had become a cash machine, and every withdrawal was made in part in my name, and I received not one penny of any of it, and did not know a single one of them had happened. I want to dwell on how completely invisible it was, because the invisibility is the point, and it is the thing that makes this happen to people who are otherwise careful. I am an accountant. I want you to sit with that. I spend my working life looking at other people's financial affairs, spotting exactly this kind of thing, warning clients about exactly this kind of exposure. And I did not know, for 22 years, that I was personally liable for a debt that grew to £250,000, because the mechanism by which I would have found out did not exist for me. I never received a statement. The account correspondence went to my parents' address. It was their house, their account in every practical sense, and the annual mortgage statement landed on their doormat, not mine. I was never asked to do anything, never contacted, never reminded. Liability that does not generate any paperwork to the liable person is a liability that person will simply forget, and I forgot completely for 2 decades. And it never showed up in a way I would notice. Because, and this is a thing very few people understand, a mortgage where you're a borrower, but the payments are made on time, does not necessarily sit prominently on your credit file in a way that screams at you, especially if you never go looking. I never went looking because I had no reason to. I applied for my own mortgage in 2009, and it was granted. The affordability worked out. Nobody flagged the old account as a problem because it wasn't then in arrears. So even the one moment it might have surfaced, it didn't, because at that point my parents were still paying and the account was still healthy. The liability was real the entire time. It just made no sound. For 22 years, it sat there growing silent attached to my name, generating not a single piece of paper that reached me until the day it stopped being paid. And the first sound it ever made was a debt collector telling me I owed £240,000. Behind my name, for 20 years, my parents had quietly borrowed a fortune. And I found out from a man in a call center reading a script. Let me tell you what jointly and severally liable actually means, because it is the most important phrase in the story, and almost nobody knows it until it is too late. When 2 or more people take out a loan together, they're usually jointly and severally liable. Jointly means they're liable together. Severally means each of them is also liable individually for the whole amount. The lender does not have to split it. The lender can pursue any one borrower for the entire debt, and then that borrower has to chase the others for their share, if they can. Which means, in practice, that the lender pursues whichever borrower has the most money. In 2023, of the 3 names on that mortgage, my father retired on a pension, my mother retired, and me, an accountant with my own house and a good salary, the borrower with the most money was, by a distance, me. So when my parents fell into arrears, because the borrowing had finally outrun even their ability to service it, the lender did not chase 2 pensioners with no assets worth taking. The lender chased me, the one with a house to put a charge on, the one with a salary to attach, the one whose credit rating could be destroyed and whose own home could, ultimately, be put at risk to satisfy a debt run up on a different house entirely. I found this out over the course of about a week. An estate I can only describe as free fall on the phone to solicitors, having realized that a favor I did at 22 made me personally liable for £250,000 I never borrowed and never saw. I want to describe that week because it was the worst of my life, and because I think anyone who has had the floor go out from under them financially will recognize the specific texture of it. The first thing that goes is sleep. I did not sleep more than 2 or 3 hours a night for about a fortnight. I would lie awake doing arithmetic, my house's equity, my salary, the debt, what they could take, running the numbers over and over in the dark. Each time arriving at the same conclusion, which was that everything I had built in 30 years of careful, responsible living could be taken to pay a debt I never incurred. The second thing that goes is your sense of your own competence. I had done everything right. I had been the careful one, the responsible one, the one who saved and planned and never overreached. I had my own modest house, a pension, no consumer debt, a good credit rating I had tended like a garden. And I discovered that all of it could be undone by 20 minutes at a solicitor's desk when I was 22, that my entire adult carefulness had been sitting on a landmine the whole time, planted by the very people I trusted most. It makes you doubt everything. If I could miss this, what else had I missed? The third thing that goes is your relationship to your own family in an instant. Because in the space of that one phone call, my parents stopped being simply my parents and became also my creditors root to me, the people who had, whether they meant to or not, put my home at risk. You cannot unknow that. Every childhood memory gets a faint new shadow over it. I did not want that. I would have given a great deal not to have to see my own mother and father through that lens, but the call center gave me no choice. I want to be clear that I do not think my parents woke up one day intending to ruin me. I don't. I think they did a series of individually rationalized things. Borrow a bit now. We'll manage. Don't worry, at ease. It's fine. Over 20 years. Each one small. Each one for a reason, and never once fully confronted what they were building in my name. But the effect of not intending it was exactly the same as if they had, and the free fall was exactly as steep. I found this out over the course of about a week, in a state I can only describe as free fall. I confronted my parents, and I wanted to describe it because their response told me everything about the 22 years. They were not ashamed. That is the thing I could not get past. My father was defensive, then aggrieved. My mother cried, but the crying was not about what they'd done to me, it was about being confronted. And my father said, "It's the family home, Adiz. We needed the money over the years, for the family, for Chike's business, for your grandmother's funeral, for emergencies. This is what a family does. The house is there to help the family, and you're part of the family, and you signed to help us, and now you're what? You're going to abandon your parents over a bank. For Chike's business." I filed that away. It became important, and my mother said, "We never thought it would come to this. We always paid. It's only these last 2 years with your father's health, we didn't want to worry you." And I said, "You borrowed £240,000 in my name." And my father said the sentence that I have thought about more than any other. "It's not in your name, it's the family's house. Your name was just to help. You don't own it, how can you owe on it?" He genuinely believed that. Or found it convenient to believe. That because I didn't own the house, I couldn't owe on it. He had it exactly, precisely backwards. I owned nothing and owed everything, the worst possible combination. And when I tried to explain jointly and severally liable to my own father, he heard it as me being cold, legalistic, and disloyal, putting bank paperwork above my family. Here is where the family close ranks, and it closed around a very effective idea. The idea was that I was abandoning my elderly parents to protect my own money, because that is what it looked like if you told it a certain way. Here were 2 frail pensioners, in their 70s, at risk of losing their home. And here was their successful accountant daughter, with her own house and her good salary, who, instead of helping them in their hour of need, was talking about liability and lawyers and getting her name off the mortgage. Refusing to help her own parents keep a roof over their heads. My brother Chike was particularly good at this framing. Chike, who I would later establish had received a very great deal of the released equity, positioned himself as the loyal child. "I can't believe you'd do this to Mum and Dad. After everything they've done for us. They're old, they're scared, and you're threatening them with solicitors over a technicality about whose name is on what. A technicality about whose name is on what. £240,000 of personal liability, described by the brother who spent a chunk of it as a technicality. An extended family took it up. An aunt rang me to tell me I should be ashamed. A cousin unfriended me. The story in the family was settled. Adiz has money and her parents need help, and she's turning her back on them to protect herself. And isn't that just like her, always the cold one, always about the money? The fact that I was personally on the hook for £250,000 I never borrowed did not feature in the family's version. Because in the family's version it was the family's house and the family's debt, and I was simply refusing to bear my share. as though my share were a moral matter of family loyalty rather than a legal fact that made the entire debt mine. 3 weeks in, I tried to sort it out in a family meeting, and it was a disaster because I did the thing I always do, which is arrive with facts. I brought the numbers. I had by then obtained a certain amount of the mortgage history. And I laid it out. The original $70,000, the successive remortgages the $240,000 balance, and the crucial point, that I was liable for all of it personally, and that this put my own home at risk. And I said, I need to be taken off this mortgage, and I need to understand where the money went because I never received any of it, and it detonated exactly the way these always do. My father stood up and said I was calling him a thief. My mother wept and said she never thought she'd see the day her own daughter brought paperwork to accuse her parents. And Chike said the thing that ended the meeting. Listen to yourself. Mom and Dad are going to lose their home, and you're sitting here with a spreadsheet worried about your credit score. Have you got any idea how that sounds? They gave you everything, and the second it's your turn to help, you're counting pennies. And the terrible thing is that in that room, with my parents crying, my careful, accurate, entirely justified account of a genuine catastrophe sounded exactly like what Chike said it was. A cold woman with a spreadsheet, prioritizing her money over her frightened elderly parents. Could not win that room. The optics were total. Frailty and tears on one side, a middle-aged accountant with a mortgage history on the other. And the fact that the accountant was the victim, the one who'd been made liable for a fortune she never touched, was invisible. Because victimhood, in a family, goes to whoever is crying, and I was too angry and too frightened to cry. I left having confirmed the family's entire story. Adiz brought a spreadsheet to threaten her parents. That's what circulated. I did not try a family meeting again. And I want to describe the months after that meeting, because the isolation of it was a specific kind of pain that the money can't measure, and because it nearly made me give up and simply pay. The family, once it had settled on its version, was relentless in a quiet way. I would get calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all following the same script. Your parents are old, they're frightened, family is everything, you can afford it. Why are you doing this? Nobody ever engaged with the actual facts. That I was liable for money I never received, that most of it had gone to Chike, that my own home was at risk. The facts were irrelevant to them, because the story had already been decided, and the story was simpler and warmer than the facts. The ungrateful daughter turning her back on her parents. And the pressure was designed, whether consciously or not, to work on exactly the trait that had got me into this in the first place, my sense of duty. I was the responsible one, the one who did the right thing, the one who helped. Now the entire family was telling me that the right thing, the dutiful thing, the loving thing, was to shut up and pay £250,000 that funded my brother's failures. My own conscience was being turned into the weapon against me. Every good instinct I had, loyalty, responsibility, love for my parents, was being pointed at my own destruction. There was a stretch, around the 4th month, where I genuinely considered it. Not because I thought I owed it, by then I knew I didn't. But because the cost of fighting was so high, socially and emotionally, and the pressure was so total, that simply capitulating and paying began to look like the price of peace. I sat down one night and worked out whether I could remortgage my own house to clear enough of it to make the family stop hating me. I got quite far into that calculation before I understood what I was doing, which was contemplating destroying my own financial life to buy back the approval of people who had wronged me. What stopped me was a single thought, and it was not noble, it was cold. It saved me. If I pay this to make them stop, they will simply do it again to me or to someone else, because I will have taught them that loading debt onto me works. The only way to make it stop was to make it not work. And so I stopped trying to win the family's approval, which was never available, and started trying to win the case, which was. I got a solicitor, and I went in certain that this was a scandal that would obviously be undone, that no one could really hold me liable for money borrowed by other people and spent by other people, that surely the law would see the unfairness. And the solicitor, a sharp, kind woman named Farida Hussein, gave me the worst afternoon of the whole thing. She said, I need to be honest with you, and it's hard. On the face of it, you are liable. You signed a mortgage deed as a joint borrower. Joint and several liability is exactly what it says. The fact that you didn't own the house, didn't benefit from the money, and didn't even know about the later borrowing does not, by itself, remove your liability. You signed. You're on the account. The lender is entitled to pursue you. And I have to tell you the hardest part. Your parents have very little worth taking. You have a house and an income, so you are not just liable in theory, you are the target in practice. If this goes to enforcement, they will come for you precisely because you are the one who can pay. I said, but I was deceived. I was 22. I was told it was a formality. I never got advice. And Farida said, those things matter, and I want to pursue them, but I need you to understand they are not automatic escape routes. I didn't understand what I signed is very rarely enough on its own. Adults are generally bound by what they sign. What we would need is something more. Evidence that you were subjected to undue influence, or that the lender was on notice of it and failed to act, or that you were never properly advised in circumstances where they should have ensured you were. There's a line of cases about exactly this, about people, very often women, pressured by family into taking on liability for family debts, and about when a lender should have insisted they get independent advice. But these are hard fought, and they turn entirely on the specific facts and the specific documents. And then she asked the question that opened the third act. So tell me, when you signed in 2001, and every time they remortgaged after, what advice were you given? Explain the liability to you. Did you ever sit down, separately from your parents, with a solicitor who acted for you and you alone? And how, exactly, was your consent to each of the later remortgages obtained? Because a joint borrower normally has to consent to further borrowing, and you say you knew nothing about any of it. And I sat there, because I suddenly realized I could not remember ever consenting to a single one of the remortgages after 2001. That realization, sitting in Farida's office, was the hinge of the whole case, and I want to explain why, because it is the thing that turned me from a victim of my own signature into someone with an actual argument. To that point, my entire problem was the 2001 signature. I had signed the original mortgage. That was undeniably my signature, my act, however poorly advised. And if the whole debt had simply been that original loan grown by interest, I would have been in very deep trouble, because you cannot easily escape a document you genuinely signed. But the debt was not the original loan. The original loan was £70,000. The debt was £240,000. The difference? £170,000 was successive further borrowing, taken out over 20 years, each instance of which required, as a legal matter, the consent of all the borrowers, including me. And I had not consented. I had not been asked. I had not known, which meant that the great bulk of the debt, the part that made this a catastrophe rather than an inconvenience, had been added to an account in my name without my knowledge or agreement. In circumstances where the lender should have been obtaining and evincing my consent and had not properly done so. Farida explained it like this. There's a difference between what you signed for and what was done in your name afterwards. You may be bound by the 2001 loan, but you cannot be bound, in the ordinary way, by borrowing you never agreed to. And if the lender advanced further sums against the security without proper, evidence consent from you as a joint borrower, then your liability for that further borrowing is very seriously in question. And that further borrowing is most of the debt. I remember the physical sensation of that landing, because for weeks I had believed I was liable for the whole $240,000 and had been budgeting my life, in my head, around losing everything. And Farida was telling me that the part I'd actually agreed to was a fraction of it, and that the rest, the ruinous part, had been loaded on without me. And that being loaded on without me was not my problem to bear, but the lender's problem to justify. And I sat there, because I suddenly realized I could not remember ever consenting to a single one of the remortgages after 2001. 3 things saved me, and each one came out of a document that somebody else had created. The first was the broker's file and the question of advice, because Farida was right to ask. And when we obtained the file for the original 2001 mortgage and the files for the later remortgages, a picture emerged that changed everything. In 2001, I had received no independent advice at all. The broker acted for my parents. The solicitor acted for my parents. Nobody, at any point, sat me down alone and explained that I was taking on full personal liability for a debt on a house I would not own. There was no record of any advice being given to me, separately, ever. I was a 22-year-old salaried employee, added to a mortgage to make the numbers work, and not one professional in that transaction treated me as anything other than a convenient income. That mattered. Because there is a well-established principle. It runs through a series of major cases about exactly this situation. That where someone stands to take on liability for another person's debts, in circumstances suggesting they may have been influenced or may not understand. The lender is put on inquiry and should ensure that person receives independent advice. And there was no evidence that had ever happened. Not in 2001, and this was the crucial part, not at any of the later remortgages either. The second was the consents. Because how had my parents remortgaged, repeatedly, against a mortgage that was in my name too, without my involvement? A further advance normally requires all borrowers to consent. And when we dug into the later files, we found the answer, and it was worse than I feared and better for my case than I could have hoped. On at least 2 of the remortgages, my consent had been provided in ways I had never given. On one, a signature that was not mine. On another, a consent purportedly given at an address I had never lived at, dated at a time I could document I was abroad. I'm not going to say the word forgery about my own parents in a way I can't fully stand behind, and the legal position became complicated, and I will not pretend it was simple. What the files showed, unambiguously, was that the later borrowing had been arranged without my genuine, informed, evinced consent, and that the lender's own files did not contain proper evidence of my agreement to loans that had grown the debt from $70,000 to $240,000. The third was where the money went, and this is the one that broke the family's story, because the family's story was that the borrowing was for the family, for emergencies, for shared need. The 2007 release, £40,000, had gone, the paper trail showed, substantially in a Chike's business. A business that failed in 2010, taking the $40,000 with it. The 2015 release, $35,000, had funded, among other things, a car and a series of transfers to Chike. Across the successive remortgages of the roughly £170,000 of equity released over the years, well over $100,000 had gone. In one form or another to or through my brother Chike, the loyal son, the one who'd called my liability, a technicality, the one who'd accused me of abandoning our parents. The house had not been remortgaged for the family. It had been remortgaged again and again to fund my brother, his businesses, his debts, his life, and the liability for it had been loaded, without her knowledge, onto the sister who received none of it and was accused of disloyalty for objecting. I want to describe what it was like to trace that money, because the process itself changed how I understood my whole family, and not in a way I wanted. I did it the way I do everything, methodically, over weeks, obtaining the remortgage completion statements, the redemption figures, the amounts released on each occasion, and then following where the released funds went. And I built a picture, release by release, of 2 decades of a house being quietly drained, and the picture had a shape, and the shape was Chike. The 2007 release, $40,000, into his first business, a venture I dimly remembered my parents being excited about, and which I now understood had been funded by a loan in my name. The 2011 release, part of it clearing debts he'd run up. The 2015 release, a car for him and cash transfers, and smaller amounts threaded through the years that were harder to trace but pointed the same way. And as the picture assembled, I had to confront a thing about my own family that I had spent my whole life not quite looking at directly, which was that Chike had always been carried. He was the favorite, the golden boy, the one whose schemes were indulged and whose failures were absorbed. And I had known that, vaguely, my whole life, in the way you know the weather of your own family. What I had not known was the mechanism by which he was carried. That for 2 decades the house had been slowly liquidated to fund him, and that the liability for funding him had been placed on me, the responsible one. Precisely because I was responsible enough to carry it and reliable enough not to check. That is the part that took the longest to metabolize. It was not just that Chike got the money. It is that the family system had, without anyone quite deciding it, arranged things so that the favorite child was funded by loading the debt onto the dutiful one. My reliability was not rewarded. It was harvested. I was the responsible child, and my reward for being the responsible child was to be the one they could safely make liable, because I was the one who would never cause trouble, right up until the trouble came to me. The house had not been remortgaged for the family. It did not go to full trial, because once the picture was assembled, the lender's position became uncomfortable, and my parents' position became untenable, and matters were resolved through negotiation and a formal complaint process that I will not detail in full because it was long and technical. But the shape of the resolution was this. The lender faced with a file showing no independent advice to a joint borrower in 2001, and no proper evidence of my consent to the subsequent borrowing, and a strong argument that they had been on inquiry and failed to act. Agreed to a restructuring that removed my liability for the great majority of the debt, in particular for the released equity that had been taken out without my proper consent, and that had funded my brother. I was left responsible, effectively, for a small proportion related to the earliest borrowing, which I accepted because there was a version of fairness in it, and because I wanted it over. And the reckoning within the family happened at a smaller gathering, and it was not about the law. It was about the money, because I put the paper trail on the table. I laid out where the released equity had actually gone, over 100,000 pounds of it, to Chike, in front of the aunt who told me to be ashamed and the cousin who'd unfriended me. And I said, "You all told me I was abandoning Mum and Dad to protect my money. I want everyone to see whose money it actually was. It was mine, borrowed in my name, that I was liable for, and I want everyone to see where it went. It didn't go to emergencies. It didn't go to keep the roof on. It went at Chike. 100,000 pounds of debt in my name went to fund my brother, and then my brother stood in that room and called me disloyal for noticing. And the room was quiet, and Chike said something about the business, about how it would have worked, about how he'd always meant to pay it back. And my aunt, the one who told me to be ashamed, looked at the figures for a long time, and then looked at Chike and said, 'You told us she was being greedy.' There was a silence after that sentence that I will remember for the rest of my life, because it was the sound of a family's story collapsing in real time. For 4 months, the entire extended family had operated on a single premise, that I was the greedy one, protecting my money, abandoning my parents. Every phone call, every cold shoulder, every lecture about family loyalty had rested on that premise, and in that silence. As my aunt looked from the figures to Chike and back, the premise died. Because the figures said something the story could not survive. That the money I was accused of greedily protecting was money that had been taken in my name and given to the very brother who had led the campaign to shame me. And Chike, to his enormous discredit, did not take the moment to be honest. He did what people like Chike always do when the ground opens under them. He got angry at the person who had opened it. He said I had gone digging to humiliate the family, as though the crime were the discovery of the truth rather than the truth itself. He said the business would have worked, and that he'd always intended to sort it out. He performed grievance loudly to fill the silence, because the alternative to performing grievance was sitting in it, and he could not sit in it. But it didn't work that time, because the figures were on the table and everyone had seen them. And my aunt, who had rung me specifically to tell me I should be ashamed of myself, did not apologize to me exactly, but she stopped speaking to me in that tone then and afterward, and a few weeks later she rang me and asked awkwardly how I was getting on with it all, which from her was a white flag. The story had held for 4 months on the strength of tears and blood, and the assumption that the accountant with the spreadsheet was the villain. It took about 90 seconds of actual figures to end it. That is the thing about these family narratives. They are enormously powerful and completely brittle, because they are built on everyone agreeing not to look at the numbers, and they cannot survive the numbers being put on a table where everyone has to look. A liability was reduced to something manageable, and I cleared it, and my own home was never at risk again, and my credit recovered, though it took time. My parents' house was in the end sold. There was no avoiding it. The debt was too large and the equity too eroded, and they moved into a smaller place, a rented flat, which is a hard thing to watch your elderly parents do, and which I did not enjoy the way you might expect. I took no satisfaction in it. And I want to be honest about the guilt, because it is real and it complicates everything and nobody warns you about it. There's a version of this story where I am simply the wronged party and my parents are simply the villains, and I can walk away clean. That is not the version I gotta live, because the truth is more tangled. My parents did a reckless, damaging thing to me over 2 decades, and they also lost their home in their 70s, and I was in a sense the instrument of that loss. Because it was my legal action that forced the true position into the open and made the sale unavoidable. They would say I sold their house from under them. That is not what happened. The debt sold their house, the debt they created, and it would have been sold anyway once they could no longer pay it. But there is a version, and the family tells it. in which the successful daughter turned on her elderly parents and cost them their home, and I have had to learn to live alongside that version, and to accept that some people I love will believe it until they die. And underneath the family's unfair version, there's a small, true, private grief that is mine alone. I did protect myself, and protecting myself did contribute to my parents ending their lives in a rented flat, and both of those things are right, and they do not cancel out. I would do it again. I had to. My own home was at stake, and I had done nothing to deserve losing it. But I had to, and it still hurts to have done it, live in me at the same time, and the second one does not go away just because the first one is true. That is the thing these situations do that the money never captures. Even when you are completely in the right, even when the documents prove it, even when the law vindicates you, you can still be left holding a grief that has no villain to hang itself on. Because the people who wronged you are also people you love who are now worse off partly because you defended yourself against them. Nobody prepares you for winning and grieving at the same time. They were foolish and they were reckless with my name and they never truly apologized. But they were also two old people who lost their home, and I found, to my surprise, that I could hold both of those truths at once and that the second one still hurt. My parents and I have a thin, careful relationship now. They have never fully accepted that they did anything wrong. My father's position to this day is that it was the family home and the family used it, and that I made a legal case out of a family matter. My mother has come closer, she said to me once quietly. We shouldn't have kept doing it without telling you, which is the nearest thing to an apology I have received and which I have decided to accept. Because she's my mother, and she's old, and I do not want to spend her remaining years at war. Chike and I do not speak. He has never acknowledged that the debt load onto my name funded his life. His position, relayed through relatives, is that I went after the family and humiliated him over money that was always going to come good. 100,000 pounds of my liability funded his failures, and in his telling, I am the one who behaved badly by producing the bank statements that showed it. My sister Ngozi in Canada was on my side from the first phone call, having never been asked to sign anything, and said the thing that I have held on to. They asked you because you were the responsible one. They didn't ask me because I'd left, and they didn't ask Chike because Chike was the one spending it. You got picked precisely because you were the one who'd never say no and never cause trouble. Your reliability was the whole reason they used you. Here's the last thing. I have thought for 2 years about what actually happened, and it comes down to a single sentence my father said, which was wrong in law and revealing in every other way. You don't own it, how can you owe on it? Because that sentence contains the entire trap, and the trap catches people, very often young women, very often the responsible child, by the thousand. Owning and owing are not the same thing, and they can be pulled completely apart. You can own something and owe nothing on it. You can owe everything on something you do not own at all. The second position, full liability, zero ownership, is the worst place a person can be put, and it is precisely the place a young person is put when they are added to a family mortgage, just to help the numbers. They are given all of the debt, and none of the asset, and they are told it is a favor. And they sign it at 22 because their parents asked them to, and because nobody explains that the words on the mortgage and own the house describe completely different things. I was on the mortgage. I never owned the house. And for 22 years, my parents borrowed against a name that carried all the risk and held none of the value, and handed most of the money to my brother. And when the bill came, it came to me. What saved me was not that the unfairness was obvious. It was obvious, and obviousness saves no one. What saved me was documents that other people had created and never expected me to read. A broker's file that showed I was never advised, lender records that showed I never properly consented, and bank statements that showed where the money really went. You don't own it, how can you owe on it? I owed £250,000 on a house I never owned, Dad. That's not a contradiction. That's the whole thing you did to me in one sentence, and you still don't know you said it. I was 22. You asked me to help. I signed where the man pointed. It took me until I was 53 to sign my way back out.